King Solomon is a name that'd make anyone sit up and listen. The Bible talks a big game about this guy, painting a picture of a king who ruled over a huge chunk of land and was so wise, he could solve any problem. Imagine having a brain like that. People say he built the most amazing temple you've ever seen, right there in Jerusalem. And he is the richest man to have ever lived. Even today, we still talk about King Solomon. He's that kind of legendary. And now, a bunch of archaeologists from Israel have just found King Solomon's tomb. Can you believe it? It's been hidden for over 3,000 years. So, what kind of treasures and clues about the past did they find? Join us as we dive into this mystery together and see what secrets King Solomon's tomb holds. King Solomon's tomb, a historic discovery. For ages, people have been on the hunt for King Solomon's tomb. Some folks thought the whole thing was just a story, since nobody had found it yet. But not anymore. A bunch of smart scientists and treasure hunters, led by this awesome lady named Eilat Mazar, made a mind-blowing discovery. They found the spot where King Solomon's final resting place might be, right in the city of David. Now, this wasn't Dr. Mazar's first rodeo. Back in 1986, she found a super old gatehouse near the city of David. At the time, she couldn't say for sure if it was Solomon's, so she kept quiet about it. Fast forward to 2009, Dr. Mazar decided to dig around the gatehouse again. Can you believe she found a whole bunch of super old stuff everywhere she dug? This stuff was like a time capsule from way back when King Solomon was alive. With all these new clues, she took another look at the gatehouse and realized it was probably built around the 10th century BC, which is when King Solomon was boss. So, why should we trust Dr. Mazar's findings? Dr. Eilat Mazar was no ordinary scientist. She was a brilliant mind with a deep-seated respect for the scientific method. Her favorite saying, "We must let the stone speak," perfectly captured her approach to archaeology. It was as if the artifacts themselves held the key to unlocking the past, and Mazar was determined to listen intently. Even outside the world of academia, her reputation was stellar. Herschel Shanks, a well-known American lawyer, wrote a glowing article about her in 2007 for Biblical Archaeology Review. He didn't mince words when he praised her professional skills, saying that no one would dare question her abilities as an archaeologist. Mazar was often labeled a biblical scientist, a term that accurately reflected her unique approach to research. Unlike many of her colleagues who kept their religious beliefs separate from their work, she saw no conflict between the Bible and scientific inquiry. In fact, she believed that the two could complement each other, offering different yet equally valuable perspectives on the past. This open-minded attitude was refreshing in a field where science and religion were often seen as opposing forces. Among the countless treasures unearthed at the excavation site, over 30 bulli were discovered. These tiny clay seals, once used to close documents, held the potential to reveal fascinating details about the people and events of the past. One particular bulla caught Mazar's eye, sparking a level of excitement that was rare in the usually reserved world of archaeology. Her enthusiasm was a stark contrast to the skepticism that often greeted attempts to combine science and religion. It was clear that Mazar's deep knowledge of archaeology was instrumental in making this groundbreaking discovery. What made this find even more remarkable was that the team hadn't set out to find Solomon's tomb. Their initial goal was much grander. They were searching for the remains of King David's palace. While digging through the oldest part of Jerusalem, they stumbled upon something truly colossal, a massive wall segment stretching over 2,110 feet. Known locally as the Cave of the Kings, this mysterious structure was shrouded in intrigue. Who built it? What was its purpose? The archaeologists were eager to uncover the secrets hidden within its ancient stones. The segment they uncovered included a gatehouse, a corner tower, and a royal structure. The archaeologists were stunned by the wall's size, suspecting it might be part of an even grander building like a temple or palace. They were thrilled at the possibility that this structure was connected to King Solomon's reign. Radiocarbon dating indicated that the site was from the period when King Solomon ruled. Dr. Mazar noted that this was the first time they had found a structure from that era that could match the descriptions of King Solomon's buildings in Jerusalem. But could this have been built by another king and not Solomon? So, why is she so sure that it is Solomon's? Well, Dr. Mazar explained that there weren't many kings from the 10th century who could have built such a structure. Essentially, it could only have been David or Solomon. According to the Bible, King David, known for his battle with Goliath, was the father of King Solomon, who is credited with constructing the first temple of Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Ceramics discovered near the wall helped date the structure to the second half of the 10th century BC, which was the era of King Solomon. Near the gatehouse, they found large earthen water storage vessels, one of which bore a Hebrew inscription indicating it belonged to a high-ranking government official. Other finds included figurines typical of 10th century BC Jerusalem, such as four-legged animals and large-breasted women, likely symbolizing fertility. Moreover, archaeologists found jar handles with inscriptions mentioning the king and various Hebrew names. This makes the discovery even more fascinating and important. The historical and archaeological value of these finds cannot be overstated, as they provide a deeper understanding of the period and its people. The monumental goal of uncovering King Solomon's Temple. Finding King Solomon's Temple has been a big dream for archaeologists for ages. It's like searching for a legendary treasure chest filled with history. Recently, they stumbled upon a pretty cool discovery, a piece of an old wall in Jerusalem's Ophel area. This spot is super old and people think it's where King David, Solomon's dad, had his palace. This new find is like adding a missing puzzle piece to the story of the area. It makes the tales about King Solomon, the super famous ruler of ancient Israel, seem even more real. Before, some people thought he was just a small-time leader, but this discovery paints a picture of him as a powerful king who ruled over a big kingdom, just like the Bible says. The city of David, named after Solomon's dad, is thought to be the oldest part of Jerusalem. It's like the city's grandparent. People believe this is where King David set up shop after kicking out the Jebusites, who lived there before. Lots of cool old stuff has been found here, giving us a peek into Jerusalem's early days. The city of David, also called Wadi Hilwa, is a really important archaeological site. It's like an open book about what Jerusalem looked like thousands of years ago. This place is packed with history, from super old walls to fancy stone buildings. It's like a time machine that takes us back to the Bronze and Iron Ages. One of the coolest things ever found in the city of David is the Solomon Tunnel, which people also call Hezekiah's Tunnel. It's like this super old, super smart way to bring water into the city. You won't believe how clever the people who lived in Jerusalem back then were. We used to think King Hezekiah built it, but some new digging around says it might be even older than that. And guess what else they found nearby? A Roman-era pool called the Pool of Solomon and a really neat set of steps. Today, you can visit all these amazing old places because they're part of the Jerusalem Walls National Park. It's run by the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, but the Ir David Foundation is in charge of the day-to-day stuff. You can find this park in Wadi Hilwa, which is kind of like an extension of the Silwan neighborhood in East Jerusalem. There's also an Israeli settlement close by. It's a pretty important place for archaeologists to learn about the past. The quest for royal tombs. Another cool thing they found is a huge stone building that some people think might be the leftovers of King David's palace. If this giant building really is connected to David and Solomon, it shows just how important the city of David was back in the day when they were kings. It was like the center of power and running things. Even though they've made some amazing discoveries and found really important stuff lately, archaeologists before them had a tough time finding any royal tombs for Solomon or the kings after him. There are a few reasons why those old king tombs were missing in action. Maybe the city of David is just so big that they haven't looked everywhere yet. Or, with all the wars and crazy stuff that happened in Jerusalem over the years, the tombs might have been destroyed or really messed up. It's possible they're buried under newer buildings. But these challenges didn't stop archaeologists from hunting for those royal tombs. They knew how important it would be to find them because it would tell us a lot about the kings of ancient Israel and how they did things back then. Discovering those tombs would give us a peek into how they ran the country and what they were like as people. It would be like finding a treasure trove of information about life in ancient Israel. Even though they haven't found the tombs yet, the stuff they have found in the city of David is still super cool. The mysteries of Solomon's tomb. Before Dr. Mazar came along and shook things up, people had been scratching their heads for ages about where King Solomon might be buried. Some folks thought his final resting place was hidden under the Temple Mount, a spot that's super important to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Muslims call it the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, and it's where they believe the Prophet Muhammad took a magical nighttime trip on a flying horse. That incredible story is why the beautiful Dome of the Rock is there. The Temple Mount has had a wild history. Everyone from the Jebusites to the British has wanted a piece of it. It's a tiny place, but so much has happened there. Imagine trying to dig up secrets in a place where everyone's been fighting over for thousands of years. That's what archaeologists had to deal with. The people in charge of the Temple Mount for Muslims, called the Waqf, weren't too keen on digging around, saying it was disrespectful to a holy site. So, while some adventurous Europeans poked around in the late 1800s and the British did a little digging when they were fixing up the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the early 1900s, no one really got a good look at what was underneath. It was like trying to find a needle in a really big haystack. Even if Solomon's tomb was down there, it could have been anywhere. Without a proper search, it was all just guesswork. Old stories and writings talk about burying important people near the Temple Mount. They say kings like Solomon might be buried close by. And since Solomon's temple, a big deal for the Israelites, was built right there, it made sense that his tomb would be nearby. Plus, some ancient texts mention secret tunnels and rooms under the Temple Mount, which sounds exciting, right? But without being able to explore those places, it's tough to say if any of it is real. For centuries, people have been fascinated by the story of King Solomon, the legendary ruler known for his wisdom and wealth. A big part of this fascination is the enduring mystery of where he's buried. Archaeologists have been carefully poking around the Temple Mount for ages, hoping to find Solomon's final resting place. It's a delicate job because they want to protect the historical importance of the site. They've discovered some really cool old stuff, but no luck finding the king just yet. Imagine the excitement if they did. It would be a huge deal for history buffs and religious folks alike. But the search isn't limited to the Temple Mount. Some people think Solomon might be buried on Mount Zion, which is linked to King David. However, there's been a bit of a mix-up. King David is actually buried in a different part of Jerusalem, not Mount Zion. Archaeologists in the early 1900s found some stuff they thought might be royal tombs, but we now know that's where David is. So, that theory about Solomon being on Mount Zion doesn't really hold up. There are even crazier ideas out there. Some folks believe Solomon's body was whisked away to Ethiopia and buried in a secret spot. They point to some old Ethiopian stories about having things that belonged to Solomon, like his crown and throne. Another idea is that Solomon might not be buried at all. Maybe he was cremated or something. It's all pretty wild speculation, really. So, where is Solomon's tomb? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe one day we'll find out, but until then, the mystery lives on. Another interesting place archaeologists are actively trying to decipher is Zedekiah's Cave. Zedekiah's Cave. Secrets of Zedekiah's Cave. Way down under the noisy, busy streets of Jerusalem's old city, there's a secret world full of mystery and old stories. Imagine a place hidden in the dark, with walls that whisper tales of ages gone by. That's Zedekiah's Cave. People also call it Solomon's Quarries. It's a huge hole in the ground made of limestone rock, and it's been a puzzle for smart people, adventurers, and curious travelers for hundreds of years. Legend says this giant underground space, big enough for 5 city blocks, was a hideout for King Zedekiah, a ruler from Judea in the 6th century before Jesus was born. When the Babylonian army was trying to take over Jerusalem, the story goes that King Zedekiah ran away to hide in the cave. A famous storyteller named Rashi tells a super exciting tale about Zedekiah's escape. He says the king hid in the cave and ran through its twisty tunnels towards the plains of Jericho. As Zedekiah was sneaking through the dark, something amazing happened. They say God sent a deer to run above ground, leading the soldiers who were chasing the king right to the cave's exit just as Zedekiah came out. That's how they caught him and made him blind. This spooky story makes the cave even more interesting, but it's the connection to the Freemasons that really gets people talking. The Freemasons think Zedekiah's Cave is a special place and that it was where the Knights Templar used to meet. They believe the cave has secret symbols and codes that hold the group's hidden knowledge. But there's no real proof for this idea. Debunking myths. Before folks started digging around, there was a lot of guesswork about where to find Solomon's final resting place. Archaeologists, scientists, and history buffs alike had their own ideas. Many pointed a finger at Mount Zion, a hill in Jerusalem closely tied to the city of David. They thought this might be the royal graveyard for the Davidic dynasty, including the great King Solomon himself. But here's the thing, they were barking up the wrong tree. It's a common misconception that King David is buried on Mount Zion. Nope, that's not right. His actual tomb is in the southeastern corner of Jerusalem's Old City, just below the Temple Mount. This area is known today as Ir David, or the City of David. The Bible, in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 2, verse 10, tells us that David died and was put to rest in the City of David. It also gives us a timeline. David ruled Israel for 40 years, 7 of those in Hebron and the other 33 in Jerusalem. After David passed, his son Solomon took over. Now, let's clear up something about Zion. When people talk about Zion, they're usually referring to ancient Jerusalem. But there's a mix-up that happened in the Middle Ages. Pilgrims from the Byzantine Empire got a bit lost and thought the hills south of the Armenian Quarter in today's Old City was part of the Old City. So, they called it Mount Zion. Truth is, the city David conquered was on a lower hill south of the Temple Mount. This was originally a Jebusite city, but David made it his capital. For over 200 years, this was the whole of Jerusalem. Later on, the city grew and spread westward, eventually including the area we now call Mount Zion. So, for ages, people had the wrong idea about where King David was buried. Then, in the 2nd century, Jerusalem got into a lot of trouble. The city was destroyed, Jews were sent away from their homes, and people started to forget where David's tomb was. Luckily, the Bible gives us a hint. It says that David, Solomon, and a bunch of other Judah kings over the next 150 years were buried in Ir David, which is probably part of today's City of David. Early archaeological discoveries. Back in 1913, a French guy named Raymond started digging around in Jerusalem's City of David. He thought he might find some old tombs, maybe even the final resting place of those early kings from the Old Testament. Some people didn't buy into his ideas, but another archaeologist named Jeff Zorn thinks might have been onto something. For ages, folks believed King David's tomb was on Mount Zion. That's what a historian named Josephus said in the 1st century. But if you look at the old Bible stories, it sounds like David and the other kings from that time were buried closer to the southern end of the Old City of David. Jeff Zorn has a pretty interesting theory. He thinks there might be 2 old tunnels in the City of David where they buried those early kings. A long time ago, in the 1800s, a diplomat named Charles Claremont Ganneau thought something funny was going on. He figured the curvy path of Hezekiah's tunnel was made to avoid messing with the old king's graves. While started digging on some land owned by a guy called Baron Rothschild in 1913, then kept going in 1914 and again from 1923 to 1924. Even though people had dug around there later and messed things up, found some cool stuff, old walls, pools for rituals, water tanks, and a round tower that might have been for keeping pigeons. But the biggest deal was 9 spots carved into the rock that looked like tombs. He thought the fancy ones, called T1, T2, and T3, might be where the Old Testament kings were buried. After hearing all this, some people think maybe Solomon's tomb was hidden on purpose to keep bad guys away. That was a common thing to do with royal graves back in the day. Some folks even think Solomon might be buried somewhere else, maybe outside the Old City of David because of trouble with politics or religion during those crazy times. The tomb. Now, let's talk about the Tomb of the Kings in Jerusalem. It's open to visitors now, but for a long time, people thought it was the final resting place of King David and King Solomon. Turns out, that's not quite right, but the name stuck. This place is super old, built around the year 100. A French explorer named Louis Félicien de Saulcy was one of the first people to really look around the place in 1863. He was hoping to find proof that David and Solomon were buried there. Some folks think his dig was the start of modern archaeology in Jerusalem. Anyway, he found some old coffins, and one of them, with some writing on it, is now in a famous museum in Paris. Imagine this, a dark, old room filled with shadows. That's where King Solomon's body was chilling for thousands of years. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, a smart archaeologist, is looking at the body, his breath making little clouds in the cold air. After 3,000 years, they finally open the tomb where Solomon was supposed to be. And guess what? They find his crown. It's covered in shiny sapphires, and there are cool pictures on it showing how smart and strong Solomon was. As the archaeologist, Hayes, carefully looked over the king's fancy walking stick, a feeling of wonder filled the old burial place. The walls were covered in scrolls that everyone thought were lost forever. These scrolls told stories of teaming up with other countries and taking over lands, which changed the world a long time ago. One scroll was in amazing shape and had Solomon's own thoughts about fairness and running a country. The writing was beautiful and kind of hard to figure out. Hayes' heart was pounding as he realized how much history he was seeing. Could these old things change how we think about Solomon's time as king? Every little thing, from shiny gold decorations to old coins, gave us clues about a time that was full of secrets and power. These discoveries were going to tell us more than just about Solomon. They were going to show us the complicated story of old kingdoms that no one remembers. Hayes was thinking about all this and wondered what other secrets were buried under the ground, waiting to be found. When you look at old stuff and think about what might be true, it gives you interesting ideas about where Solomon's final resting place could be. Some of these old things are called bulli and seals and have names on them from the time of the Bible, even from when Solomon was alive. These are like little puzzles that show us where his tomb might be. A bulla is like a tiny tag made of clay or soft metal. A long time ago, people used these to make sure that important papers couldn't be changed. Around 8,000 years ago, farmers in a place called Sumer used little clay things to keep track of their animals and stuff. Later, they wrote on the clay instead of using the things, and this is how writing started about 3,100 years ago. The first ones were found in a place called Zagros in Iran. After that, people started making similar tags out of metal and called them bulli. Most were made of lead, but some rich people even made them out of gold, like the kings of the Byzantine and Holy Roman Empires. Recent archaeological discoveries. Recently, some folks digging around in Israel found 6 fancy clay seals. This was a big deal because it showed that this place wasn't just some sleepy little town. It was actually a busy center for running the country and doing business. The stuff carved on these seals is really impressive, showing off how smart and talented people were back then. They even found seals and papers that prove they had a good system for running the kingdom. Imagine if they found King Solomon's tomb. It would be like finding a treasure chest full of history. Not only would it prove all those old Bible stories were true, but it would also show us just how rich and powerful the old Israelite kings were. Everyone would want to come check it out and learn all they could about life back then. But finding Solomon's tomb isn't a walk in the park. The land is rough and there's a lot of trouble going on there. It's hard to dig around and look for things when you're not safe. Plus, finding one tiny tomb in a huge old place is like looking for a needle in a haystack. It takes a lot of time and planning. Even though it's tough and time has passed, people still love the idea of finding Solomon's tomb. There's a place called the Tomb of the Kings where they think some royal people might be buried. And guess what? They found some cool stuff there and in the city of David, like seals with names of kings people thought were just made up. This has made everyone super excited about learning more about the old days. So, is King Solomon's legacy fact or fiction? Even though we found some pretty cool stuff, there's still a lot of back and forth about whether people like David and Solomon were real or not. For instance, some folks digging around found what they think are Solomon's stables in Megiddo, which is the place they think Armageddon will happen. The Bible says Solomon had a bunch of horses and chariots in Megiddo and 2 other cities. But when they looked closer, they didn't find any horse bones or anything that really looked like stables. So, that's a bit of a puzzle. People have also been hunting for Solomon's famous mines because he needed a lot of stuff to build the first temple. Most of the time, they haven't found much. But in 2017, someone found a big old copper mine in Jordan that's really old. It's from about the same time Solomon was around. So, if Israel owned that place, they could have gotten rich and had lots of stuff. Besides looking for stuff in the ground, people who study the Bible have been taking a closer look at the stories about Solomon. There are some really wild tales, like him having 700 wives and 300 girlfriends. That's a lot of people. They also say one of his wives was the Pharaoh's daughter, but there's no proof of that in Egyptian history. People think Egyptian kings were scared to give their daughters away because it could cause problems. But one of the craziest stories is that Solomon had a whopping 1,400 chariots. That's a huge army. But we haven't found any real proof of his stables, and the Bible says the Egyptian king Shishak came and beat up Israel just 5 years after Solomon died, taking all the temple stuff. If that's true, Solomon's army couldn't have been that strong. Because of all these big stories, some people who study the Bible think maybe Solomon was made to sound way cooler than he really was. They might have wanted to make their people seem as important as other famous kingdoms. Controversy and debates. So, what do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more fascinating stories and facts, be sure to subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.